Hi, my name is Scott Park Phillips, and I've written two books on the history of Chinese martial arts. And I want to talk about a difficult subject, which is that I don't use the word Qigong, and I don't think other people should use it. And I'm going to try and explain quickly why and then go into some of the history. The simple reason is that the word itself was coined by the Chinese Communist Party specifically to obscure the origins of the traditions which it draws from. And it did this in order to stop people from being free, fundamentally, to constrain the possible ways in which people experience their own being, and to eliminate religion in general. And the word really is associated, its rise in a which is well documented in a book from 2007 by David A. Palmer as a term. The book is called Qigong Fever. And what happened after the Cultural Revolution, which ended in 1976, after 10 years of horrors, people were desperate for some acknowledgement, some self-expression, some recovery of their humanity. And it was illegal to be depressed. I know that sounds crazy, but it was. And you couldn't openly express being depressed over what had just happened. And people turned to this sudden new phenomenon called Qigong, and it turned into a fever, like huge numbers of people pouring into the streets and practicing Qigong as a way of, you might say, freeing themselves of negative emotion or expressing the extreme pain, a way of, you might say, an ecstatic dance. And it turned into lots of different, what you might call qigong cults, little religious movements. And the what happened, Falun Gong is the best known one. They had to flee the country, and lots of people have been locked up and imprisoned. Lots of leaders of qigong cults were assassinated, and lots just stopped. They were warned and they stopped. And talking openly about the origins of Qigong, much less the possibilities of Qigong as a religious practice, um, is punished. You lose your career. This is what happens right away. So I don't think we should use the word anymore. I think we should go back to what it was. And this is particularly important because if you don't know the origins of a method that you do, if you don't know the history of it, you're really likely to miss the fruition, extremely likely to miss the fruition of the practice. If you don't know who created, you don't need to know the person, but if you don't know what type of person created what they created it for, you're going to miss the fruition. And that's not an easy question to answer. I'm not going to cover that in its entirety here because that actually requires real research. That requires real in-depth research. And so let's go back to the beginning. There's something called Daoyin or Daoyin in China that is similar to yoga, and we have documented from there's the oldest version of it was pulled out a scrappy piece of silk from a tomb called Ma Wang Dui in the 2nd century BCE, that shows people doing these movement practices that and it's called Daoyin. And so, and we have Daoyin documented throughout Chinese history from that point on. People were doing movement practices, and it's almost entirely associated with Taoism up until the Sung Dynasty and up until about 1200. And within Taoism, it has a very specific role. I'm not going to go into it entirely here, but Daoyin, you could, to summarize it, uh, is a kind of it's a transformation of your being. And one of the things you might do is explore what a human being can be, what a human being is, the limits of being a human. So you might experience the absolute wildest end of what human being can do with their body, and the quietest end, the calmest, quietest. So you have these two extremes, but that's formulated. Those, what can a human being do? It's formulated in a lot of different ways, and one of the ways is by what kind of animals can you be, for instance. And it was used usually in conjunction with meditation as a way to make it possible for you to sit still for long periods of time. And what happened during the Tang Dynasty, and then really clearly, the Tang Dynasty, a type of meditation associated with Taoism, or initially exclusively with Taoism, called the Golden Elixir, or Jin Dan, um, developed. It was already there, and it became extremely elaborate. I mean, these were members of the royal family. They had absolute free time. Everyone had their own private meditation chamber, and they had money for servants, and they were literate, and they had masters from India and Tibet and all over the place, and they really developed this meditation practice deep. So for me to talk about what the Golden Elixir is in a short video um, is ridiculous, but it's really important for understanding what the Chinese government was trying to cover up. In fact, my shirt here is a depiction of the Golden Elixir, the rabbit in the moon. And it's a depiction of a type of Golden Elixir meditation. And the rabbit is actually making the elixir of immortality. And, immortality, the word is xian in Chinese. And what's important just up front to know about xian, or becoming an immortal, is that it's absolutely unique for every individual. It's a type of individualism. And you could say in this early era, in the Tang Dynasty, say 600, part of what defined individuality was actually your lineage, like all of your family and all of your teachers were also, in a sense, becoming immortals with you. And then later in the Tang Dynasty, that they got from Buddhism the idea that you're transforming all sentient beings. So there's a lot of religious complexity here. But what happened in the Sung Dynasty, so let's say 10th century, something like that, is the Daoyin and Jindan. So Daoyin and the Golden Elixir got really combined into not into one thing, but into one thing that incorporated the other thing. Like they're self-reflective. They're both reflective. You do one, you also are doing the other, and that idea then became the basis for the training of theater, and theater became really the most common form of religious expression in China, beginning at that time, and that's what Shaolin Monastery was, in a sense. It was an orphanage. They sent orphans to Buddhist monasteries, and they were practicing a type of Buddhism which, at least in the meditation itself, probably comes from Taoism. A bit controversial for me to say it, but I'm not the only one who thinks that. And they were also doing Golden Elixir and Daoyin combined, and that's actually what Shaolin became. It's a version of that, of the incorporation of those things together. And I'm talking about the martial art. And the same thing with the theater. The theater was, they're constantly fighting on stage. They were training. Martial arts, it's the same art. It diverges for all sorts of reasons, but we're talking 1,000 years. It's the same art. And so so what you have then, Daoyin actually it's worth defining the term. The term Dao is the term for, probably everyone knows this term. There's no way to define it. It's everything definable and everything undefinable. It's limitless, everything without limits and everything with limits. It's it's this term for greater than great, lesser than less, together. And or you might even say beyond human experience, but permeating human experience. And but that character has the character sun underneath it for the character for inch. So it's because Dao also means road. So it's like the little tweak you need to get back on the road, the little inch movement. So it could be sometimes translated as guiding, but it really means to inch or tweak or just get it, just a little bit adjustment, a small adjustment to get back with the Tao, to unify with Tao. And then yin or yin is literally means to pull a bow, but this is not, the pulling of a bow. It's not the same metaphor that we use in English. It means to open up empty space, the empty space of potential power. So it's like there's a space between the string and the bow itself, and that empty space is potential power, potential energy, really, in the physical sense. So you're opening up spaces in your body. That's what Daoyin means. And when it's combined with the golden elixir, what you're doing is you're in brief, is you're reordering your perception action loops. So you move differently. Another way I summarize the whole thing is you're separating your story, the sort of story about what you are, what your conception, your body image, all of that, everything that you could call story, from your body itself. And of course, these are two always go together, the body and the story. But you actually practicing sort of pulling them apart and then letting them snap back together. And so it's a pretty deep practice. It's awesome, in fact. And what the communists were doing was trying to erase that history, trying to erase that. In the late 1800s, the second half of the 18th century, there were a huge number of religious cults in China, and lots of them practiced some version of the golden elixir and Daoyin, and martial arts too. These were all mixed together, and theater, in fact, theater was the theater of the gods. So all the religious cults did something theatrical, and theatrical with the gods, and Daoyin was a way of you could represent the gods through your body. You could embody a particular deity, for instance, through the same mechanism. So it's deeply religious practice, and again, it comes from Taoism clearly, but it early on infiltrated Buddhism and the theater, which is also a religious phenomena, and then lots of little cults, like everywhere. And then as the 20th century got going, these cults were heavily influenced by Christianity and became what sometimes are called redemptive societies. Qigong Dao is one of the best known that went to Taiwan. They were kind of universalist religious traditions, and they practice these movement practices for the same reason, that they allow you to transform your view. There's a tool, in a sense, and a chest of tools for transforming the way you see your body in relationship to the world. Your body being the primary site for ritual action in this religious tradition, which is very different than the West. The West, very different. And so I don't think we should use the word Qigong. I think we should refer specifically to Daoyin and Jindan, the golden elixir. And because that's actually where it comes from. And if you're a tradition, if you actually have a tradition that you could trace, or Qigong, it's going to go back to some religious phenomenon. The claim that there is some pure doctor tradition is largely false. Um, the doctors were religious people just like everyone else, and they're getting their Daoyin from Taoism. They're getting their health practices. It may be there's some unique application. I wouldn't deny that people were going to do this movement. It'll heal your lungs. In fact, that's how Qigong actually got adopted by the communists. What happened is that in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the Communist Party, which was not in power, was fiercely anti-traditional medicine of any kind and wanted everyone to practice science-based medicine. And what happened is that all the doctors went to Christian colleges. Like everyone who was trained as a doctor went to a Christian college. And they didn't all become Christians, but they were all heavily influenced by it. And when the communists took power in 1949, every like doctors knew it and they fled the country. There weren't that many to begin with, and the ones that could fled, and the ones that stayed, lots of them were killed um, or imprisoned, and it wasn't great to be a doctor. So the communists early on realized they had a problem. They didn't have enough doctors, so they started coming up with strategies, training people on very basic skills. Um, but they also decided that they should allow some traditional Chinese medicine, since um, a certain clique within the Chinese Communist Party argued that it worked. Particularly, there's one guy, I forget his name, but it's in David Palmer's book, Qigong Fever, from 2007, and he uh, had some kind of lung disease. I think it was tuberculosis or something like that, and nothing was working for him. And he found a Buddhist monk, a kind of esoteric monk, who taught him some chants that he had to do every day, and with counting the beads, and gave him and there were movement exercises that went with that, and it healed him over a period of months. And so this guy said, hey, we should include this kind of stuff in uh, in our hospitals. And it became something taught exclusively in hospitals where they didn't really have doctors. And they needed a name for it. And the word gong means work. So gongzi is your job. And qi, they took the word qi. They wanted to pull it out of its religious context, try to make it sound scientific. This is a complicated issue. The book covers that well. But basically, the term qigong means that your qi job or your qi work that you have to do while you're in the hospital. And after the Cultural Revolution, so we're jumping ahead to 67, uh, there was another clique that, it was really in the 80s, that said it's okay to practice qigong. Um, it's basically they were they were claiming it was a communist invention, that it was science-y, um, and at the same time, right? I already said that whole thing. It was illegal to be depressed, so people latched onto this as the way they could express themselves. And again, it's really associated with a lot of horror and murder, and it's you you can't look up qigong in any classic text. You can't get before 1949. Um, And so I think we should stop using it. I think it would be wonderful if everyone stopped using it and instead referred to the actual traditions that it comes from, namely Daoism, and uh, sometimes it's martial arts that it comes from directly. Uh, Jindan, the golden elixir. There are other dans that have this name, and stop using that idea of a gong. That's completely communist. It's not work. It's actually the exploration of what you are, what your fundamental nature is, what your fundamental, it's an exploration of your being, of your fate, of your, of is it what constitutes being human, your perceptions, your body, your story. And that's all I have to say for now. Thanks for listening. You can grab copies of my books at Amazon.com, and you can get my newsletter by going to scottparkphillips.substack.com.